The winter of 1887 brought more than just howling winds and bitter cold to the frontier town of Cedar Creek, Montana Territory. It brought two pregnant women, really out of childhood themselves, who would change the life of one broken-hearted preacher and transform an entire community in ways no one could have imagined. What began as an act of desperate abandonment would become the foundation for the most remarkable story of faith, sacrifice, and divine providence that the American frontier had ever witnessed. Reverend Thomas Mitchell stood in the doorway of his modest wooden church, watching the pre-dawn darkness give way to gray February light. At 42, the widowed preacher carried the weight of personal grief that had settled into his bones like the Montana cold. 3 years had passed since consumption claimed his beloved wife Sarah and their unborn child, leaving him to minister to a growing frontier community while battling his own crisis of faith. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind picked up across the prairie, rattling the church's simple windows and sending snow devils spinning across the cemetery where Sarah lay buried beneath a modest wooden cross. Thomas pulled his worn coat tighter and prepared to retreat inside when a sound stopped him cold. It was barely audible above the wind, but unmistakable once heard, the soft crying of an infant, his heart racing. Thomas stepped onto the church's covered porch and immediately saw them. Two young women, neither appearing older than 16, huddled together on the wooden steps. Both were heavily pregnant, their thin shawls providing inadequate protection against the brutal cold. One held a crying newborn, wrapped in what appeared to be a torn petticoat, while the other clutched her swollen belly with the unmistakable expression of someone in active labor. "Dear God," Thomas whispered, rushing forward without hesitation. "Ladies, what are you doing out here? You'll freeze to death." The girl holding the baby looked up with eyes that held too much sorrow for someone so young. Her dark hair was matted with snow, and her lips were blue with cold. "Please, Reverend," she managed through chattering teeth. "We have nowhere else to go." Thomas didn't waste time with questions. He gathered both women in his arms, supporting the one in labor as contractions racked her small frame. "Inside, quickly. We need to get you warm and safe." The interior of Cedar Creek Community Church was sparse but clean, with simple wooden pews arranged before a modest altar. A pot-bellied stove in the corner provided blessed warmth, and Thomas quickly stoked the fire to chase away the deadly cold that clung to the young women's clothing. "I'm Emma Walsh," the girl with the baby said once they were settled near the stove. "This is my twin sister Lucy. We've been traveling for days." Lucy Walsh was clearly in the advanced stages of labor, her face pale and drawn with exhaustion. Thomas had assisted with births before during his ministry, but never under such desperate circumstances. He quickly gathered clean cloths and heated water, praying silently for wisdom and skill he wasn't certain he possessed. "Where did you come from?" he asked gently, trying to keep both sisters calm while preparing for what was about to happen. "Chicago," Emma replied, rocking her newborn daughter with practiced motions despite her obvious youth. "Our father, he threw us out when he discovered our condition. Said we were a disgrace to the family name." The cruelty of their situation struck Thomas like a physical blow. Two pregnant children, cast out by their own father, had somehow traveled over 1,000 miles across dangerous frontier territory in the dead of winter. The fact that they had survived at all seemed miraculous. Lucy's labor progressed rapidly, and within 2 hours of their arrival at the church, Thomas found himself delivering a healthy baby boy, while Emma assisted with remarkable composure for someone so young. The sound of the infant's first cry, echoing through the church, seemed to fill the sacred space with new hope and possibility. "He's beautiful," Thomas said softly, wrapping the newborn in a clean blanket. "You've been blessed with a fine son." Lucy Walsh looked at her baby with an expression that mixed overwhelming love with profound sadness. At perhaps 16 years old, she possessed a maturity that spoke of hardships no child should have to endure. Her hands, though young, held her son with natural instinct and fierce protectiveness. "We can't keep them," Emma said quietly, the words falling like stones into the warm church air. "We have no money, no family, no way to provide for them properly." Thomas felt his breath catch in his chest. The implications of their statement began to dawn on him as he looked between the two sisters and their newborn children. They hadn't simply sought shelter from the storm. They had come to abandon their babies. "What are you saying?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We heard in the last town that Cedar Creek had a good preacher who helped people in trouble," Lucy explained, her voice growing stronger now that her labor was complete. "Someone who might take care of children who had no one else." The request hung in the air between them like a challenge to everything Thomas thought he understood about his calling and his capacity for sacrifice. He had been struggling with his own faith since Sarah's death, questioning whether God had abandoned him or whether he had abandoned God. Now these two young women were asking him to take responsibility for two innocent lives when he could barely manage his own. "I don't know anything about raising infants," he said honestly. "I'm a bachelor now, living alone, barely managing to keep myself fed and clothed." Emma shifted her daughter in her arms, and Thomas caught sight of the baby's perfect tiny fingers and peaceful sleeping face. "But you're a man of God," she said simply. "If anyone could give them a good life, it would be someone like you." The logic was both compelling and terrifying. Thomas had devoted his life to serving others, to being a shepherd for his flock and a voice of comfort in times of trouble. But caring for two newborn infants represented a level of responsibility that went far beyond anything his ministry had ever required. "Where will you go?" he asked the sisters, knowing that their options in 1887 Montana Territory were limited and dangerous for two young women alone. "There's talk of work in the mining camps further west," Lucy replied. "Kitchen help, laundry, cleaning. Hard work, but honest work that might let us rebuild our lives." Thomas understood the unspoken reality of their situation. The mining camps were rough places where single women faced constant danger and few opportunities for advancement. But for two disgraced young mothers, they might represent the only chance for economic survival and eventual respectability. The baby slept peacefully near the warm stove, unaware that their entire futures hung in the balance of this conversation. Emma's daughter had wispy blonde hair that caught the firelight, while Lucy's son displayed the robust health that would serve him well on the frontier. Both children were beautiful, innocent, and completely dependent on adult decisions they had no power to influence. "I need time to think," Thomas said finally. This is the most important decision I've ever been asked to make." "We understand," Emma replied. "But we can't stay long. Every day we delay makes our journey west more dangerous as winter deepens." The practical concerns were overwhelming. Thomas lived in a small cabin behind the church, a space barely adequate for one person, let alone a family. His minister's salary was modest, sufficient for his simple needs, but hardly enough to support two growing children. He had no experience with infant care, no knowledge of child rearing, and no family nearby to provide guidance or assistance. Yet as he watched the babies sleep, something stirred in his chest that he hadn't felt since Sarah's death. Purpose, not just the abstract purpose of ministry, but the immediate, tangible purpose of protecting and nurturing these vulnerable lives. The idea terrified him, but it also awakened something he had thought permanently lost. "Tell me about their fathers," he said gently, needing to understand the complete situation before making any commitments. The sisters exchanged glances heavy with shared pain and secrets. "There were no fathers," Emma said finally. "Not in any way that matters. We were We were used by men who had no intention of taking responsibility for the consequences. The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the harsh reality of what they were describing. Two young women, probably little more than children themselves when their troubles began, had been taken advantage of by men who had abandoned them to face the consequences alone. Their father's reaction had been to cast them out rather than seek justice or provide support. Thomas felt anger rise in his chest at the injustice of their situation. Two innocent children would grow up without fathers because of men who lacked the courage and character to accept responsibility for their actions. Two young women had been forced to make impossible choices because the adults who should have protected them had failed utterly in their obligations. "I'm sorry," he said simply, knowing that words could never address the magnitude of what they had endured. "We don't want pity," Lucy said with quiet dignity. "We want our children to have opportunities we can't provide. Education, stability, a community that will accept them despite the circumstances of their birth." The weight of their request settled fully on Thomas's shoulders. They weren't just asking him to care for two babies, they were asking him to give these children the kind of life that would honor their potential and overcome the stigma of their illegitimate birth. In 1887 frontier society, that was a monumental challenge that would require not just personal sacrifice, but community support. As if reading his thoughts, Emma spoke again. "We know it's asking too much. We know you have every right to refuse. But when we heard about you, about how you've helped other people in this town, we hoped. Her voice trailed off, but the message was clear. They had traveled over 1,000 miles in winter conditions that could have killed them, driven by nothing more than hope that one good man might be willing to give their children a chance at a better life. Thomas looked around his church, seeing it with new eyes. The simple pews could accommodate families with children. The space near the altar could host baptisms and confirmations. The community that gathered here each Sunday included farmers, merchants, and craftsmen who might be willing to help raise two orphan children if they understood the circumstances correctly. "If I were to consider this," he said carefully, "I would need to know that you're absolutely certain about your decision. These children would become my responsibility completely. You couldn't return in a year or two and demand them back." "We understand," both sisters said almost simultaneously. "And I would need to be honest with the community about their origins," Thomas continued. "I won't start their lives with lies that might be discovered later." Emma nodded firmly. "Honesty is better than deception. These children deserve to know the truth about where they came from, even if it's painful." The conversation continued through the morning hours as Thomas grappled with the most significant decision of his life. The practical challenges seemed insurmountable, but something deeper was pushing him toward acceptance. Perhaps it was divine guidance, or perhaps it was simply the recognition that sometimes life offers opportunities for redemption that must be grasped despite their difficulty. By midday, the babies had awakened for feeding, and Thomas watched the sisters care for their children with obvious love and expertise despite their youth. The tender way Emma sang softly to her daughter, while Lucy ensured her son was properly fed and burped, spoke to natural maternal instincts that would make their sacrifice even more profound. "What are their names?" Thomas asked as he prepared a simple meal for the sisters. "We haven't given them names yet," Lucy replied. We thought whoever raised them should have that honor." The gesture was both generous and heartbreaking. By leaving their children unnamed, the sisters were symbolically transferring not just physical custody, but emotional ownership to whoever would become their adoptive parent. It was perhaps the most complete form of sacrifice possible for a mother. To make as afternoon shadows lengthened across the church floor, Thomas made his decision. The choice felt both terrifying and inevitable, as though every experience of his life had been preparing him for this moment of complete commitment to something larger than himself. "I'll take them," he said simply. I'll raise them as my own children and give them every opportunity I can provide." The relief and gratitude in the sister's eyes was overwhelming. Emma began crying softly while Lucy clutched her baby closer, as though trying to memorize every detail of his face before the final separation. "Thank you," Emma whispered. "Thank you for giving them a chance." The rest of the day was spent in practical preparations for the sisters' departure and the baby's transition to their new life. Thomas learned about feeding schedules, sleeping patterns, and the basic care that would keep the infants healthy and thriving. The sisters shared what little they had in terms of baby clothes and supplies, though it was pitifully inadequate for long-term care. As evening approached, the moment of final separation arrived with inevitable certainty. The sisters dressed their babies carefully, kissed them tenderly, and placed them in Thomas's arms with the kind of fierce love that made their sacrifice all the more remarkable. "Take care of them," Emma said through tears. "Help them grow into good people." "I promise," Thomas replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. And then they were gone. Two young women disappearing into the Montana winter darkness to face an uncertain future, leaving behind the most precious things they possessed, because love sometimes requires the courage to let go. Thomas stood alone in his church, holding two sleeping infants whose lives had just become his complete responsibility. The magnitude of what he had committed to was overwhelming, but for the first time since Sarah's death, he felt truly alive with purpose. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as he introduced his unexpected family to the Cedar Creek community. But tonight, he simply held the babies close and marveled at how two abandoned children had somehow become the answer to prayers he hadn't even known he was praying. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The first Sunday morning after the twins' arrival dawned crisp and clear, with February sunlight streaming through the church windows and illuminating dust motes that danced in the warming air. Thomas Mitchell stood before his congregation with two sleeping infants in wooden cradles he'd hastily constructed during the week, knowing that this moment would define not only his future, but the moral character of Cedar Creek itself. 43 members of the community had gathered for worship, their faces displaying various degrees of curiosity, concern, and barely concealed judgment as they filed into the simple wooden pews. Thomas could feel the weight of their collective gaze as conversations died and attention focused on the unexpected additions to their usual Sunday routine. "Friends," Thomas began, his voice steady despite the nervous energy coursing through his veins, "before we begin our worship this morning, I need to share something that will affect all of us." Martha Henderson, the town's unofficial moral authority and wife of the general store owner, sat rigid in the front pew with her arms crossed and lips pursed in obvious disapproval. Behind her, the Carlson family whispered among themselves while young Billy Patterson craned his neck to get a better look at the babies. "Last Tuesday morning, God brought two precious lives to our church steps," Thomas continued, gesturing toward the cradles. "Abandoned by circumstances I won't detail out of respect for privacy. These children now need what every child deserves, a loving home and a community that will help them grow into the people God intends them to be." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas could practically hear the mental calculations taking place as his congregation processed the implications of his announcement. In frontier communities where resources were scarce and survival often uncertain, taking on additional dependence was viewed as either saintly charity or dangerous foolishness. Henry Carlson, a successful cattle rancher whose opinion carried significant weight in community decisions, cleared his throat and stood. "Reverend Mitchell, we all respect your charitable instincts, but have you considered the practical implications? Raising two children requires resources this community can barely spare." "I've considered little else this week," Thomas replied honestly. "But I believe that when God places responsibility before us, He also provides the means to fulfill it. Margaret Foster, a young mother herself, spoke up from the middle of the church. Reverend, what about the children's real parents? Shouldn't they be held accountable for their offspring? The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with moral implications. That everyone understood. Illegitimate children were society's reminder of moral failure, and their presence challenged comfortable assumptions about respectability and social order. The mothers made the ultimate sacrifice of love, Thomas said carefully. They gave up their children to ensure those children would have opportunities they couldn't provide. As for the fathers, he paused, choosing his words with deliberate precision. They have chosen not to accept their responsibilities. Old Samuel Brooks, whose weathered hands spoke of decades of frontier hardship, struggled to his feet with the aid of his walking stick. At 74, he was the community's eldest member and unofficial voice of hard-won wisdom. I've seen a lot of children in my time, Brooks said slowly, his voice carrying the authority of experience. Legitimate and otherwise. What matters isn't how they got here, but what we do with them now that they're among us. The baby girl chose that moment to wake up and begin crying, her small voice filling the church with the unmistakable sound of immediate need. Thomas moved quickly to lift her from the cradle, but Martha Henderson was faster. Give her here, Martha said briskly, her stern expression softening as she took the infant into experienced arms. Poor little thing probably needs changing. The simple act of Martha Henderson, the community's strictest moral guardian, voluntarily caring for an abandoned infant, sent a powerful signal through the congregation. If Martha could find compassion for these children, others could follow her example without fear of social judgment. The question before us, Thomas said as Martha expertly soothed the baby, is not whether these children deserve our help, but whether we deserve the privilege of helping them. William Patterson, Billy's father and one of the town's more progressive thinkers, stood to address the gathering. Reverend Mitchell, what specific help do you need from the community? The practical question opened the floodgates for constructive discussion. Thomas had spent the week cataloging the challenges ahead. Feeding 2 infants required milk, which meant negotiating with dairy farmers. Clothing them required fabric and skilled seamstresses. Caring for them during church services needed volunteer assistance. And providing for their future required long-term planning that extended beyond his own resources. Mrs. Anderson has a milk cow that's been producing more than her family needs, offered James Anderson, the blacksmith whose wife had lost a baby the previous year. She might be willing to share. I've got fabric scraps from winter sewing projects, added Rebecca Walsh, no relation to the abandoned twins' mothers. Not much, but enough to make infant clothes and blankets. Dr. Jonathan Hayes, Cedar Creek's only physician, cleared his throat before speaking. I'll provide medical care for the children at no charge. Growing infants need regular monitoring, and frontier conditions can be harsh on young immune systems. The offers of help began flowing faster than Thomas could track them. The Miller family volunteered weekly child care during church services. The Cooper women offered to organize a rotating cooking schedule to ensure Thomas ate properly while managing infant care. Even Henry Carlson, despite his initial skepticism, promised building materials for expanding Thomas's small cabin. But it was 10-year-old Sarah Jenkins who provided the moment that would become legend in Cedar Creek's history. Standing on her pew to be seen over adult heads, she announced with childhood clarity, "My mama says babies are blessings from God, no matter how they get here. If these are God's babies, then they're our babies too." The child's simple theology cut through adult complications and touched something fundamental in the community's collective soul. These weren't abandoned orphans to be pitied. They were new members of the Cedar Creek family to be celebrated and protected. Thomas felt tears threatening as he watched his congregation transform from skeptical observers into protective extended family. The babies had been in the community for barely a week, but they were already catalyzing changes that would strengthen social bonds for generations. "There's one more thing," Thomas said as the initial wave of volunteer enthusiasm settled. "These children will need names. I've thought about it extensively, and I believe their names should reflect their arrival here and their future in this community." He lifted the baby boy from his cradle, holding him high enough for everyone to see. "I'd like to name him Matthew Mitchell, Matthew meaning gift from God, and Mitchell to give him the legal right to call me father." The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. By giving the child his own surname, Thomas was making a public declaration of permanent commitment that went far beyond temporary charity. "And this beautiful little girl," he continued, taking her gently from Martha Henderson's arms, "will be Grace Mitchell, Grace for the unmerited favor God has shown all of us through her presence." The names were perfect, carrying both spiritual significance and the promise of full acceptance into the community. Matthew and Grace Mitchell would grow up as legitimate members of Cedar Creek society, their origins acknowledged but not held against them. But the real test of community acceptance came 3 days later, when word spread that federal marshals were asking questions in the neighboring town of Willow Creek about 2 young women who had been seen traveling west with infants. The marshals claimed to be investigating a kidnapping case filed by a Chicago businessman named Patrick Walsh. Thomas received the news from Henry Carlson, who had ridden hard from Willow Creek to deliver the warning. "They're looking for twin sisters," Carlson reported breathlessly. "Said their father wants them found and brought home." The implications were terrifying. If Patrick Walsh could convince federal authorities that his daughters had been kidnapped or coerced into leaving Chicago, he might be able to reclaim not only his daughters, but potentially the grandchildren they had given up. Thomas's legal claim to the babies was based entirely on verbal arrangements with no official documentation. "What do we do?" asked Martha Henderson, who had become one of the baby's most devoted caregivers despite her initial reluctance. "We tell the truth," Thomas replied, though his voice carried uncertainty about whether truth would be enough to protect the children. That evening, the entire community gathered in the church for an emergency meeting. The babies slept peacefully in their cradles, unaware that their futures hung in the balance of adult decisions about loyalty, honesty, and moral courage. "If federal marshals come asking questions," William Patterson began, "we need to decide collectively how to respond." The discussion that followed revealed the depth of transformation that had already taken place in Cedar Creek. These weren't just Thomas's adopted children anymore. They had become everyone's children, protected by bonds of affection and commitment that had formed with surprising speed. Patrick Walsh threw out his pregnant daughters in the dead of winter, Samuel Brooks observed with characteristic directness. Whatever his legal rights might be, he forfeited his moral rights when he chose cruelty over compassion. Margaret Foster added practical concerns. Even if Walsh found the girls, what about the babies? They were freely given to Reverend Mitchell by their mothers. That has to count for something legally. Dr. Hayes contributed medical perspective. Moving newborn infants in winter conditions could be dangerous or even fatal. Any court would have to consider their welfare above abstract legal principles. But it was Martha Henderson who proposed the solution that would define Cedar Creek's character for generations. "We protect them," she said simply. "All of them. The babies, Reverend Mitchell, and those poor girls wherever they are now. We became a family this week, and families protect each other." The unanimous agreement that followed was swift and absolute. Cedar Creek would present a united front to any outside authority that threatened their newly expanded family. Stories would be consistent, support would be unwavering, and the children's welfare would take precedence over everything else. As the meeting concluded and families began returning to their homes, Thomas stood in the church holding Matthew while Grace slept nearby. The weight of community support felt almost as overwhelming as the original responsibility of caring for 2 infants, but infinitely more reassuring. "Thank you," he said to those who lingered to help bank the fire and tidy. "The church. I never imagined ... That's what neighbors do," Martha Henderson interrupted with characteristic briskness. "We take care of each other, especially the ones who can't take care of themselves." The next morning brought fresh snow and renewed determination as Cedar Creek prepared to face whatever challenges might come from outside authorities. But it also brought something else, the recognition that crisis had revealed the community's true character. And that character was stronger and more generous than anyone had dared hope. Matthew and Grace Mitchell had found more than a father and a home. They had found an entire community willing to fight for their right to grow up safe, loved, and free from the sins and failures of adults who had shaped their early circumstances. The foundation was now set for everything that would follow. 3 weeks after the community's protective pledge, the federal marshals arrived in Cedar Creek. On a blustery March morning that carried the promise of spring, but still held winter's bite. Marshal Theodore Garrison and his deputy, a stern-faced man named Collins, rode into town with the unmistakable authority of federal law behind them, and enough firepower to handle serious resistance. Thomas Mitchell watched their arrival from the church steps while Matthew slept against his chest in a hand-sewn carrier that Margaret Foster had crafted. The sight of federal badges and official paperwork filled him with dread, but also with a resolve he hadn't known he possessed. 3 weeks of caring for 2 infants had transformed him from a grieving widower into a fiercely protective father, and he would not surrender his children without a fight. "Reverend Mitchell?" Marshal Garrison dismounted and approached with the practiced courtesy of a man accustomed to delivering unwelcome news. "I'm Marshal Garrison, and this is Deputy Collins. We need to speak with you about some children that may have been left in your care." "Marshal," Thomas replied evenly, shifting Matthew slightly to ensure the baby remained comfortable. "What can I help you with?" Garrison consulted an official document before continuing. "We have a complaint filed by Patrick Walsh of Chicago regarding his twin daughters, Emma and Lucy Walsh, who disappeared from his home in January. He believes they may have traveled west with infants born out of wedlock." The formal language couldn't disguise the ugly reality of the situation. Patrick Walsh had thrown out his pregnant daughters in deadly winter conditions, but now wanted to reclaim them and potentially their children when federal law might support his paternal authority. "I see," Thomas said carefully. "And what does Mr. Walsh want with daughters he apparently abandoned?" "That's not how he tells it," Deputy Collins interjected with obvious skepticism about Thomas's version of events. "He claims the girls ran away without permission and may have been coerced or deceived by persons unknown." The accusation hung in the air like gun smoke. If Walsh could convince authorities that his daughters had been kidnapped or manipulated into leaving Chicago, it would change the legal dynamics completely. Thomas realized he was facing not just a custody dispute, but potential criminal charges. "The truth is simple," Thomas replied with quiet dignity. 2 young women in desperate circumstances brought their newborn children to my church seeking help. I provided that help according to my Christian duty and my conscience. Marshal Garrison's expression suggested he had heard many versions of truth during his career and trusted none of them completely. "We'll need to see the children and any documentation regarding their care." "Of course," Thomas agreed, knowing that cooperation was his best strategy for maintaining legal legitimacy. "Though I should mention that you're not the first to take interest in their welfare." As if summoned by divine timing, Dr. Jonathan Hayes emerged from the general store and approached the group with professional authority. Behind him came Martha Henderson, Henry Carlson, and several other community members who had somehow learned of the marshal's arrival with remarkable speed. "Marshal," Dr. Hayes said, extending his hand in greeting. "I'm Dr. Hayes, the local physician. I understand you're investigating the welfare of our newest community members." Garrison accepted the handshake while studying the growing crowd of Townspeople, your newest community members? Matthew and Grace Mitchell, Martha Henderson announced firmly, moving to stand beside Thomas in a gesture of unmistakable support. Fine children being raised by a good man with the help of everyone. In Cedar Creek. The message was clear. These children belonged to the entire community, not just to Thomas or to distant relatives who had shown no previous interest in their welfare. It was a declaration of collective ownership and protection that carried significant weight in frontier society. "We'd like to examine the children," Deputy Collins said, his tone suggesting this was a demand rather than a request. "Certainly," Dr. Hayes replied smoothly. "As their physician, I can provide complete medical records documenting their health and development since arriving in our community." The marshals exchanged glances, clearly recognizing that they were dealing with an organized community response, rather than a simple custody investigation. Thomas led them toward the church while townspeople followed at a respectful distance, their presence both supportive and subtly intimidating. Inside the church, Grace slept peacefully in her cradle, while Matthew remained content in Thomas's arms. The baby showed the healthy development that spoke of excellent care and abundant love, contradicting any suggestion of neglect or improper treatment. "Healthy-looking children," Marshal Garrison observed, his professional demeanor softening slightly as he watched Grace's peaceful sleep. "They've been well cared for," Dr. Hayes confirmed, producing a leather folder containing detailed medical notes. Regular feeding schedules, proper hygiene, appropriate clothing for weather conditions, and no signs of illness or distress. Deputy Collins examined the improvised nursery that Thomas had created in the church's side room, noting the hand-built cribs, carefully organized supplies, and obvious evidence of devoted attention to infant needs. Whatever else might be true about the situation, the children were clearly receiving exemplary care. "What about the mothers?" Garrison asked. "Have you had any contact with them since they left the children?" "None," Thomas replied truthfully. "They made their decision and moved on. I've honored their wishes by not seeking contact." "And where did they go?" "West, toward the mining territories. Beyond that, I don't know and didn't ask." The honest admission served Thomas well, demonstrating that he had no hidden agenda regarding the young women's whereabouts or future plans. His concern had been entirely focused on the children's welfare rather than controlling their mothers. Samuel Brooks chose that moment to enter the church, moving slowly but with obvious purpose. The old man's presence commanded respect from everyone present, including the federal marshals who recognized the moral authority that came with age and experience. "Marshals," Brooks said with courtly dignity, "I understand you're investigating the welfare of our youngest citizens." "That's correct, sir," Garrison replied respectfully. "Then you should know that Cedar Creek has never seen finer children or a more devoted father," Brooks declared with absolute conviction. "Whatever brought them here, they belong here now." The statement was both simple and profound, cutting through legal complications to address the fundamental question of where these children could best thrive. In frontier communities where survival often depended on mutual support, belonging was more important than blood relations or legal documentation. The law requires consideration of parental rights, Deputy Collins pointed out, clearly uncomfortable with the community's unified stance. "Whose parental rights?" Martha Henderson asked sharply. "The father who cast out his pregnant daughters in winter, or the man who spent every night for 3 weeks feeding and caring for abandoned babies?" The question highlighted the moral complexity that legal systems struggled to address. Patrick Walsh might have biological and legal claims to his grandchildren, but Thomas Mitchell had demonstrated actual commitment and sacrifice that created stronger bonds than mere genetics. "There's something else you should know," Henry Carlson announced, producing a document from his coat pocket. "The territorial judge has been informed of this situation. Judge Morrison is expected to arrive next week to conduct formal hearings regarding custody and adoption proceedings. The news surprised everyone, including Thomas. The community had apparently been more proactive in protecting his legal position than he had realized. By involving territorial courts, they had ensured that any federal action would require coordination with local legal authorities who understood frontier conditions and community values. Marshal Garrison studied the document with obvious concern. Federal marshals preferred clear jurisdictional authority, and the prospect of territorial court involvement complicated their mission significantly. Judge Morrison will want to interview all parties, Carlson continued, including character witnesses from the community and expert testimony about the children's welfare. How many character witnesses? Deputy Collins asked, though his tone suggested he already suspected the answer. All of us, Martha Henderson replied simply. Every adult in Cedar Creek will testify to Reverend Mitchell's character and these children's proper care. The scope of community support was unprecedented in the marshal's experience. Typically, custody disputes involved family members arguing over children while communities remained neutral. But Cedar Creek had collectively adopted these children as their own, creating a legal and social dynamic that federal law wasn't equipped to handle effectively. We'll need to send word to Mr. Walsh about these developments, Marshal Garrison decided. He may want to come west for the territorial hearings. That's his right, Thomas acknowledged, though the prospect of facing Patrick Walsh directly filled him with anxiety. I hope he'll do what's best for the children rather than what satisfies his pride. Dr. Hayes cleared his throat before speaking. Marshals, I feel obligated to mention that moving newborn infants in winter conditions could be medically dangerous. Any custody arrangement would need to prioritize their health and safety. The medical concern added another layer of complexity to an already difficult situation. Even if Patrick Walsh had legal rights to his grandchildren, exercising those rights might endanger the very children he claimed to want back. As the marshals prepared to leave, having gathered enough information to file their initial report, Grace woke and began crying with the healthy lung capacity of a thriving infant. Thomas moved immediately to comfort her, and the sight of his natural, practiced response to her needs spoke louder than any testimony about his qualifications as a father. She's hungry, Martha Henderson observed, approaching with a prepared bottle, right on schedule. This little one knows what she wants and when she wants it. The domestic scene, devoted father, supportive community member, and healthy, well-cared-for children presented a compelling picture of successful family life. Whatever legal complications might arise, the practical reality was that these children were thriving under current arrangements. We'll be in touch, Marshal Garrison said as he prepared to depart. The territorial hearings will determine the final outcome, but for now, the children appear to be in good hands. After the marshals rode away, the community gathered in the church for an impromptu meeting about the challenges ahead. The prospect of territorial hearings meant months of uncertainty, potential legal expenses, and the possibility that Patrick Walsh might successfully reclaim his grandchildren. What do we need to do to prepare? William Patterson asked practically. Document everything, Dr. Hayes replied immediately. Medical records, feeding schedules, growth measurements, behavioral observations. We need to prove that these children are thriving under current care. And we need to understand our legal options, Henry Carlson added. Territorial adoption laws, parental rights statutes, and precedents for similar cases. But it was young Margaret Foster who raised the most important question. What happens to Reverend Mitchell if he loses the children? He's built his whole life around them now. The question hung in the air like incense, heavy with implications that no one wanted to consider directly. Thomas had transformed from a grieving widower into a devoted father, finding purpose and joy that had seemed permanently lost after Sarah's death. Losing Matthew and Grace would devastate him in ways that went far beyond simple disappointment. We won't lose them, Martha Henderson declared with fierce determination. These children belong here, with us, and we'll fight for them with everything we have." As the meeting concluded and families returned to their homes, Thomas stood alone in the church holding both babies while contemplating the uncertain future ahead. The next few months would test not only his legal claim to fatherhood, but the entire community's commitment to protecting their newest members. But for tonight, Matthew and Grace were safe, loved, and home where they belonged, regardless of what distant relatives or federal authorities might claim about their proper custody. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but today had proven that Cedar Creek possessed the collective courage to face whatever came next. Judge Morrison arrived in Cedar Creek on a Tuesday morning in late March, traveling in a well-appointed carriage. That announced his importance to anyone observing his approach. Behind him, in a second, less elegant wagon, came Patrick Walsh, a man whose expensive Eastern clothing and imperious bearing immediately marked him as someone unaccustomed to frontier accommodations or frontier justice. Thomas Mitchell watched their arrival from his expanded cabin, where community volunteers had spent the past 2 weeks, building additional rooms to accommodate his growing family's needs. Matthew lay sleeping in a hand-carved cradle while Grace played contentedly with wooden toys that Henry Carlson had whittled during long evening hours. The domestic scene represented everything Thomas had fought to build and protect over the past 6 weeks. "He looks exactly like I expected," Martha Henderson observed grimly, studying Patrick Walsh through the cabin window. Angry, entitled, and completely out of place in civilized society. The harsh assessment wasn't entirely fair, but it reflected the community's collective judgment about a man who had expelled his pregnant daughters during a Montana winter. Whatever Patrick Walsh's legal rights might be, his moral authority had been forfeit when he chose cruelty over compassion. Judge Morrison proved to be a thoughtful man in his 50s whose weathered hands and practical clothing suggested familiarity with frontier conditions despite his official position. He accepted Thomas's invitation to tour the improvised nursery and examine the children's living conditions with the careful attention of someone who understood that legal decisions affected real lives. "Impressive arrangements," Morrison commented as he noted the carefully organized supplies, detailed feeding charts, and obvious evidence of devoted care. "These children appear to be thriving under current circumstances." Patrick Walsh, however, showed no interest in domestic details or child welfare considerations. His attention focused entirely on locating his granddaughter and grandson, whom he examined with the detached assessment of someone evaluating property rather than family members. "They're healthy enough," Walsh conceded grudgingly, as though admitting that Thomas had performed adequately as a temporary caretaker. "But they belong with their proper family in Chicago, not with strangers in this wilderness." "Strangers?" Dr. Hayes interjected sharply. "Reverend Mitchell has spent every night for 6 weeks caring for these children while you were comfortable in Chicago, making no effort to ensure their welfare." The confrontation between Walsh's presumed authority and the community's protective loyalty created immediate tension that Judge Morrison needed to address carefully. Territorial hearings often involved conflicting interpretations of family rights, but rarely with such obvious community investment in the outcome. "Mr. Walsh," Morrison said diplomatically, "perhaps you could explain your perspective on these circumstances for the record." Walsh straightened his expensive coat and assumed the bearing of a man accustomed to having his opinions treated as authoritative pronouncements. "My daughters are minors who left home without permission during a family disagreement. They were obviously confused and frightened, making decisions they weren't mature enough to handle properly." The euphemistic language couldn't disguise the reality that Martha Henderson immediately challenged. "Family disagreement? You threw out 2 pregnant children in January weather. That's attempted murder, not disagreement." "Mrs. Henderson," Judge Morrison warned gently, recognizing the need to maintain courtroom decorum despite strong emotions, "please allow Mr. Walsh to present his statement completely." Walsh glared at Martha before continuing. I may have spoken hastily during a moment of disappointment, but my daughters knew they could return home whenever they chose. Instead, they apparently gave away my grandchildren to strangers and disappeared into dangerous territory where anything could have happened to them. Thomas felt anger rising in his chest at Walsh's self-serving revision of events, but forced himself to respond calmly. Your daughters made the ultimate sacrifice of parental love. They gave up their children to ensure those children would have opportunities they couldn't provide themselves. They had no right to make such decisions. Without consulting me, Walsh retorted. I'm their father and these children's grandfather. Legal authority rests with blood family, not with interfering do-gooders who think good intentions supersede established law. The legal argument was technically sound, which made it all the more frustrating for Thomas and his supporters. Frontier communities operated according to practical necessities and moral imperatives, but formal law often prioritized abstract principles over human welfare. Judge Morrison consulted his legal notes before addressing the central questions. Mr. Walsh, what specific arrangements do you propose for these children's future care? Return to Chicago where they belong, Walsh replied immediately. Proper medical care, educational opportunities, social advantages that frontier life cannot provide. Whatever temporary arrangements exist here will be terminated in favor of legitimate family custody. The dismissive attitude towards Cedar Creek's capabilities sparked immediate protests from multiple community members. Dr. Hayes pointed out his medical qualifications. Margaret Foster described the educational resources being developed, and Henry Carlson detailed the economic opportunities available in growing frontier territories. Furthermore, Walsh continued, ignoring the community's objections, I intend to locate my daughters and bring them home where they can receive proper guidance about their responsibilities and their futures. Thomas felt a chill of recognition at Walsh's phrasing. The man wasn't just seeking custody of his grandchildren. He was planning to forcibly retrieve his adult daughters and compel their return to a situation they had risked everything to escape. Mr. Walsh, Judge Morrison said carefully, your daughters are of legal age to make their own decisions about where they live and work. Even if you locate them, you cannot compel their return to Chicago. We'll see about that. Walsh replied with obvious confidence in his ability to manipulate legal systems to serve his purposes. The implied threat hung in the air like storm, clouds gathering on the horizon. If Patrick Walsh possessed sufficient resources and legal connections, he might be able to create difficulties for Emma and Lucy Walsh, regardless of their technical legal independence. Your Honor, Thomas said, recognizing the need to redirect attention toward the children's welfare rather than Walsh's desire for control, I request permission to present community testimony about these children's current care and future prospects. Morrison nodded approval, and over the next 2 hours, Cedar Creek demonstrated the depth of its commitment to Matthew and Grace Mitchell. Martha Henderson described the daily care routines and community support systems. Dr. Hayes presented detailed medical records showing healthy development. Samuel Brooks offered perspective on frontier, child rearing, and community values. Most powerful was the testimony of Margaret Foster, who spoke as both a mother and an educator about the advantages of raising children in close-knit communities, where every adult took responsibility for every child's welfare and development. In Chicago, Foster observed pointedly, these children would be anonymous figures in a large city, where their illegitimate birth would follow them throughout their lives. In Cedar Creek, they're beloved members of a family that includes everyone. In town, young Billy Patterson, now 11 years old, provided the most compelling testimony when Judge Morrison asked about the children's integration into community life. Matthew and Grace are our babies, Billy said with simple conviction. Everyone loves them and helps take care of them. They're the happiest babies I've ever seen. The child's uncomplicated perspective cut through legal complexities to address Fundamental questions about belonging and happiness. These children weren't just surviving in Cedar Creek, they were thriving in ways that formal institutions couldn't measure or replace. Patrick Walsh grew increasingly agitated as testimony revealed the extent of community investment in his grandchildren's welfare. His expectation of easy legal victory was being challenged by evidence of genuine alternative family structures that served children's needs effectively. "This is all very touching," Walsh interrupted sarcastically, "but it doesn't change basic legal facts. These children belong to my family, not to your community. Sentiment doesn't override established law. Neither does selfishness override moral obligation." Martha Henderson shot back before Judge Morrison could maintain order. The confrontation was escalating beyond productive discussion, prompting Morrison to call for a recess while he considered the evidence and legal precedents applicable to this unusual case. During the break, Thomas found himself alone with Patrick Walsh for the first time, creating an opportunity for direct conversation between the two men whose competing claims would determine the children's futures. "Reverend," Walsh said with forced civility, "I'm prepared to compensate you for your temporary care of my grandchildren. Say $200 for your trouble, plus travel expenses to Chicago for their delivery." The offer revealed Walsh's fundamental misunderstanding of the situation. He viewed Thomas's commitment as a business transaction that could be resolved through appropriate payment rather than recognizing it as genuine parental love. "Mr. Walsh," Thomas replied quietly, "these children aren't merchandise to be bought and sold. They're my family now, and I won't abandon them for money." "Your family?" Walsh's voice carried dangerous undertones. "You've known them for 6 weeks. I'm their blood grandfather. Blood didn't prevent you from casting out their mothers," Thomas observed. "Love made me their father when blood family failed them." The exchange crystallized the fundamental conflict between traditional authority and earned devotion. Walsh represented legal claims based on biological relationships, while Thomas embodied practical commitment demonstrated through sacrifice and service. "You have no idea what you're interfering with," Walsh warned. "I have resources and connections that can make life very difficult for frontier preachers who overstep their proper boundaries." The threat was both specific and vague, designed to intimidate without creating legal liability. But Thomas had faced down blizzards, disease, and frontier hardships that made wealthy businessmen's displeasure seem manageable by comparison. "Then, we understand each other," Thomas replied calmly. "You'll use whatever power you have to take these children, and I'll use whatever strength I have to protect them." When Judge Morrison reconvened the hearing, his expression suggested the weight of a decision that would establish precedent for similar cases throughout the territory. The legal questions were complex, but the human stakes were unmistakable. "This case involves competing interpretations of children's best interests," Morrison began formally. "Biological family relationships versus demonstrated care and community support. Legal precedent versus practical welfare considerations." The judge's preliminary comments suggested he understood both the immediate implications for Matthew and Grace Mitchell and the broader significance for frontier communities facing similar challenges to traditional family structures. "I'll render my decision tomorrow morning," Morrison announced. "All parties should be prepared for detailed discussion of implementation, regardless of the outcome." As the hearing concluded and participants dispersed to prepare for the final decision, Thomas returned to his cabin where both children waited with the patient trust of infants who had never known anything but love and security. Tomorrow would determine whether that security would continue or be shattered by legal abstractions that prioritize distant relatives over devoted caregivers. But tonight, Matthew and Grace were safe in the only home they had ever known, surrounded by the only family they had ever experienced. Dawn broke gray and cold over Cedar Creek on the morning that would determine Matthew and Grace Mitchell's future. Thomas had spent the sleepless night walking the floor of his cabin, alternately praying and planning for whatever outcome Judge Morrison might deliver. Both children had slept peacefully, unaware that adult decisions made this day would shape every aspect of their lives going forward. The entire community gathered at the church by 8 o'clock, transforming the simple wooden building into an informal courthouse where territorial law would intersect with frontier justice. Judge Morrison had requested the larger space to accommodate everyone who wanted to witness the proceedings, understanding that this decision would affect far more than just 3 individuals. Patrick Walsh arrived precisely on time, accompanied by a man Thomas hadn't seen before, a well-dressed stranger whose expensive clothing and confident bearing suggested legal training and significant resources. The appearance of additional representation indicated that Walsh was taking no chances with this proceeding. "Your Honor," Walsh announced formally, "I'd like to introduce Marcus Caldwell, my attorney from Chicago, who has traveled here to ensure proper legal representation in these custody proceedings." Judge Morrison acknowledged the introduction with professional courtesy, while clearly recognizing that the presence of a Chicago lawyer complicated the informal atmosphere he had hoped to maintain. Territorial hearings typically involved local parties presenting their own cases, not sophisticated legal representation from major cities. "Mr. Caldwell," Morrison said diplomatically, "I trust you understand that territorial proceedings operate according to local statutes and frontier practical considerations rather than formal metropolitan legal conventions." Caldwell's smile was polite but condescending. "Of course, Your Honor. However, federal law regarding family custody rights supersedes territorial variations, and we're confident that established precedent strongly supports Mr. Walsh's position." The exchange set an adversarial tone that made Thomas increasingly nervous about his prospects. He possessed community support and moral authority, but Walsh had brought professional legal expertise specifically designed to overcome such advantages. Martha Henderson chose that moment to stand and address the court with characteristic directness. "Your Honor, before you begin, there's something everyone here needs to know." Morrison gestured for her to continue, though his expression suggested concern about unexpected developments that might complicate an already difficult decision. "We received a telegram yesterday evening," Martha announced, producing a folded paper from her coat pocket. "From Emma and Lucy Walsh, the children's mothers." The revelation electrified everyone present. Thomas felt his heart stop as he realized that contact from the twins could either strengthen his position or destroy it completely, depending on what they had chosen to communicate. Patrick Walsh lurched forward in his seat, his face flushing with anger and anticipation. "Where are they? What do they want?" Martha unfolded the telegram with deliberate precision, clearly savoring the moment of maximum dramatic impact. "The message is addressed to Reverend Thomas Mitchell and the people of Cedar Creek." It reads, "Learned of custody proceedings through mining camp newspapers. Want our children raised by man who showed them love when blood family showed only cruelty. Will testify by sworn affidavit that we freely chose adoption arrangements. Do not let Patrick Walsh destroy the only good thing to come from our suffering. Emma and Lucy Walsh, Butte, Montana Territory." The silence that followed was profound and electric. Emma and Lucy Walsh had spoken across hundreds of miles to support the man who had accepted their children when their own father had rejected them. Their message carried legal weight as sworn testimony from the biological mothers, but more importantly, it provided moral vindication that cut through abstract legal arguments. "Impossible," Patrick Walsh sputtered, his composure cracking for the first time since his arrival. "My daughters are confused children who don't understand the implications of their actions." "Your daughters are adult women making informed decisions about their children's welfare," Dr. Hayes corrected firmly. "Their testimony carries full legal weight regardless of your approval." Attorney Caldwell whispered urgently with Walsh before addressing the court. "Your Honor, This alleged telegram could easily be fabricated by interested parties seeking to influence these proceedings. We demand authentication and verification of its origins. Judge Morrison examined the telegram carefully, noting the official Western Union markings and transmission details that would be difficult to forge convincingly. The document appears authentic, but Mr. Caldwell raises valid concerns about verification. How do you propose to address authentication? Henry Carlson stood from his position near the back of the church. Your Honor, I took the liberty of sending a return telegram requesting confirmation. The response arrived this morning. He produced a second telegram that he handed to Judge Morrison for examination. Emma and Lucy Walsh confirmed their previous message and add that they are prepared to provide sworn affidavits through the territorial court in Butte if necessary for legal proceedings. The additional confirmation eliminated any reasonable doubt about the mother's intentions while demonstrating that Cedar Creek had been more thorough in legal preparation than Walsh's expensive attorney had anticipated. But the most significant development came when Samuel Brooks slowly stood and made an announcement that surprised everyone present, including Thomas. Your Honor, there's one more thing that bears on these proceedings. I've been in correspondence with the territorial governor about establishing Cedar Creek as an official territorial municipality. The statement seemed unrelated to custody issues until Brooks continued his explanation. Official municipal status would provide local legal authority for adoption proceedings, child welfare determinations, and family court functions currently handled by distant territorial courts. Judge Morrison's eyebrows rose as he grasped the implications. If Cedar Creek achieved municipal status, local authorities could make adoption decisions that would be much harder for outside parties to challenge or reverse. When would such municipal status take effect? Morrison asked. The paperwork is complete and awaiting only official signature, Brooks replied. Governor Anderson indicated he could formalize the designation immediately if circumstances warranted expedited processing. Patrick Walsh's face went pale as he realized that legal technicalities he had expected to work in his favor might actually strengthen his opponent's position. Municipal courts possess significant authority over local family matters, and a community that had collectively adopted 2 children would likely support legal structures that protected those children. This is outrageous manipulation of legal procedures, Attorney Caldwell protested. You cannot create municipal authority specifically to influence pending custody cases. Actually, Judge Morrison replied thoughtfully, territorial law explicitly encourages municipal development and grants broad discretion to governors regarding timing and circumstances. If Cedar Creek meets standard requirements for municipal status, the governor's discretion and implementation timing is virtually unlimited. The legal landscape was shifting dramatically in favor of Thomas and the community, but Patrick Walsh wasn't prepared to surrender without exploiting every resource at his disposal. Your Honor, Walsh said, his voice carrying new undertones of desperation mixed with menace, I have information about these proceedings that significantly affects their legitimacy. Morrison gestured for him to continue, though his expression suggested skepticism about whatever revelation Walsh might offer. I've conducted private investigations into Reverend Mitchell's background and discovered facts that call into question his suitability as a guardian for any children, let alone my grandchildren. The accusation hit Thomas like a physical blow. He couldn't imagine what information Walsh might have obtained, but the man's confidence suggested it was significant enough to damage his custody case severely. What information? Morrison asked carefully. Walsh produced a folder from his coat with theatrical precision. Military records indicating that Thomas Mitchell was court-martialed during the Civil War for abandoning his post during combat. He's a proven coward who cannot be trusted with responsibility for vulnerable dependents. The charge was both specific and devastating. If accurate, it would undermine Thomas's moral authority and provide legal grounds for questioning his character. and reliability as a guardian. But Martha Henderson was on her feet before Walsh finished speaking. "That's a lie," she declared with absolute conviction. Thomas Mitchell served with distinction in the Union Army and was honorably discharged after being wounded at Gettysburg. "Do you have documentation to support that claim?" Attorney Caldwell asked smoothly. "Better than documentation," Martha replied. "I have an eyewitness." She gestured toward the church door, where a figure had been quietly waiting throughout the proceedings. An elderly man in a worn but clean Union Army uniform entered the church with the careful dignity of someone whose body had been broken by war, but whose spirit remained intact. Captain James Sullivan, the man introduced himself to Judge Morrison. "Formerly of the 14th Montana Volunteer Infantry. I served with Thomas Mitchell during the siege of Vicksburg and can testify to his courage under fire and his devotion to duty." The appearance of a military witness completely undermined Walsh's attempted character assassination. Captain Sullivan's presence wasn't coincidental. The community had clearly anticipated such attacks and prepared comprehensive responses. Furthermore, Sullivan continued, the court-martial records Mr. Walsh references don't exist because no such proceedings ever occurred. Thomas Mitchell was wounded while carrying fellow soldiers to safety during Confederate artillery bombardment. He saved 6 men's lives that day and earned commendation for valor. Walsh's face cycled through expressions of shock, anger, and fear as his carefully planned strategy collapsed. The false military records had apparently been his strongest weapon, and their exposure as fabrication severely damaged his credibility. With Judge Morrison, "Mr. Walsh," Morrison said with obvious disapproval, "presenting false documentation to territorial courts is a serious offense that could result in criminal charges. Do you wish to withdraw these allegations?" The information was provided by investigators I trusted," Walsh stammered, clearly realizing that his legal position had deteriorated catastrophically. Attorney Caldwell whispered urgently with his client before addressing the court. "Your Honor, we request a brief recess to reassess our presentation in light of new information." But Judge Morrison had apparently seen enough. "Mr. Caldwell, I've heard sufficient testimony to render my decision. Further delay serves no constructive purpose." The moment of final judgment had arrived. Thomas held his breath while the entire community waited to learn whether their collective efforts to protect Matthew and Grace Mitchell had succeeded or failed. After careful consideration of all testimony, evidence, and legal precedents, Morrison began formally, "I find that the best interests of the children in question are served by their continued placement with Reverend Thomas Mitchell and the Cedar Creek community." The explosion of joy and relief that followed nearly lifted the church roof. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face as the legal victory he had hardly dared hope for became official reality. But Judge Morrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore, I'm ordering immediate investigation into Mr. Walsh's submission of false documentation and recommend that territorial authorities consider criminal charges for attempted fraud and perjury." Patrick Walsh's defeat was now complete and potentially criminal. His expensive legal strategy had backfired spectacularly, leaving him facing possible prosecution while losing any claim to his grandchildren. As the community celebrated around him, Thomas realized that this victory represented more than just a custody decision. Cedar Creek had proven that frontier communities could protect their own against any external threat, regardless of that threat's resources or sophistication. Matthew and Grace Mitchell were officially and permanently home. 2 years had transformed Cedar Creek from a struggling frontier settlement into a thriving territorial municipality, largely driven by the community spirit that had emerged during the fight to protect Matthew and Grace Mitchell. The children, now walking toddlers with distinct personalities, had become the heart around which the entire town's growth revolved. Matthew, at 2 years old, displayed the fearless curiosity of a frontier child, climbing everything within reach and exploring the expanding town with boundless energy. His favorite activity involved following Henry Carlson around the carpentry shop, where the patient craftsman had begun teaching him to identify different types of wood and simple tools. Grace, equally mobile but more contemplative, showed an early fascination with books and spent hours sitting quietly while various community members read to her. Dr. Hayes had noted her exceptional attention span and suggested that she might possess the intellectual gifts that would serve her well in whatever educational opportunities the growing territory could provide. Thomas Mitchell, now officially recognized as their legal father through completed territorial adoption proceedings, had grown into his role with remarkable confidence. The grief-stricken widower of 3 years earlier had been replaced by a devoted parent whose days revolved around managing both his ministerial duties and the practical demands of raising 2 active toddlers. "Papa, up?" Grace demanded one morning, in early spring, raising her arms toward Thomas as he prepared for the day's responsibilities. The simple word never failed to move him deeply, representing the complete trust and love that had developed between them despite their unconventional beginning. "Good morning, sweetheart," Thomas replied, lifting her into his arms while Matthew climbed onto a chair to peer out the cabin window at the bustling activity in the town center. Cedar Creek's transformation was visible everywhere. The general store had expanded into a 2-story building that served both commercial and civic functions. Dr. Hayes had established a proper medical clinic with equipment donated by grateful families throughout the territory. Most significantly, the community had completed construction of a schoolhouse that would begin formal operation in the fall. Reverend Mitchell called Rebecca Walsh no relation to the twins' mothers, as she approached the cabin with her own 3 children in tow. "I hope you don't mind, but we brought some fresh milk and wondered if Matthew and Grace would like to play with our little ones while the mothers have coffee." Such informal cooperation had become standard practice in Cedar Creek, where child rearing was viewed as a community responsibility rather than individual burden. Thomas never lacked for assistance with the children, and they had grown up thinking of the entire town as an extended family network. "Of course," Thomas replied gratefully. "I need to prepare Sunday's sermon, and they always play better with other children than alone." As the children dispersed to their morning activities, Thomas found himself reflecting on how completely his life had changed since that February morning when 2 desperate young women had brought him more than he had ever imagined possible. The loneliness and spiritual crisis that had defined his existence after Sarah's death seemed like distant memories from someone else's life. His contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of Henry Carlson, whose expression carried the seriousness that typically preceded discussions of community business or potential problems. "Thomas," Carlson said without preamble, "we need to talk about the future." "What kind of future?" Thomas asked, though he suspected the conversation would involve the kind of long-term planning that frontier communities required to survive and prosper. "Cedar Creek's growing faster than we anticipated," Carlson explained, settling into a chair that groaned under his substantial frame. "We've got families coming from as far as Colorado and Wyoming, drawn by stories about our community spirit and the opportunities here." The growth was indeed remarkable. What had been a settlement of fewer than 50 people 3 years earlier now boasted over 200 residents, with new arrivals appearing almost weekly. The success story of Cedar Creek's transformation had spread throughout the territory, attracting families seeking the kind of supportive community environment that seemed increasingly rare on the frontier. "That's wonderful news," Thomas said, though Carlson's serious expression suggested complications beneath the surface prosperity. "Wonderful and challenging," Carlson continued. "We need expanded infrastructure, more housing, bigger school, additional businesses to serve the growing population. Most importantly, we need to maintain the community values that attracted people here in the first place." The observation touched on something Thomas had begun noticing himself. Some recent arrivals seemed drawn more by economic opportunities than by community spirit, and there were subtle signs of the kind of social stratification that characterized larger towns where wealth and status mattered more than character and contribution. "What specific concerns do you have?" Thomas asked. "3 families arrived last week from Denver," Carlson replied. "Wealthy investors looking to establish businesses that would serve the entire region. Nothing wrong with prosperity, but they're asking questions about social standards and community composition that suggest they might not embrace our inclusive approach to family and belonging." The coded language was transparent enough. The new arrivals were questioning whether a community that had collectively adopted illegitimate children and embraced unconventional family structures would provide the kind of respectable environment they wanted for their own families. "Have they said anything specific about Matthew and Grace?" Thomas asked, feeling a familiar protective instinct rising. "Not directly," Carlson admitted, "but there have been suggestions that a proper community should have more traditional leadership and established families in positions of influence." The implications were clear and troubling. Cedar Creek's growth was attracting people who wanted the benefits of a thriving community without accepting the inclusive values that had made that success possible. If such attitudes gained influence, they could threaten not only Thomas's family, but the entire social structure that had made Cedar Creek special. "What do you think we should do?" Thomas asked. "Document everything," Carlson replied immediately. "The adoption proceedings, the community decisions, the legal precedents we've established. Make sure our values are embedded in official municipal structures that can't be easily changed by newcomers who don't understand our history." It was a practical suggestion that reflected hard-won wisdom about protecting community gains against external pressures. Laws and official policies provided more lasting protection than informal traditions or social customs. Their conversation was interrupted by commotion from the town center, where a crowd was gathering around what appeared to be an official territorial messenger. Thomas and Carlson exchanged concerned glances before hurrying to investigate whatever news had captured everyone's attention. "Statehood legislation passed Congress," the messenger announced to the growing crowd. "Montana Territory will become Montana State within the year. All municipal governments need to update their charters and legal structures to comply with state requirements." The news was simultaneously exciting and concerning. Statehood would bring improved infrastructure, better legal protections, and enhanced economic opportunities. But it would also subject Cedar Creek to state oversight and regulations that might not recognize or protect the community innovations that had made their success possible. "What does this mean for local adoption laws?" Dr. Hayes asked, voicing the question that several people were thinking. "State laws will supersede territorial regulations," the messenger replied. "All legal proceedings will need to be reviewed for compliance with state standards." Thomas felt a chill of recognition. If state authorities decided to review territorial adoption decisions, Matthew and Grace's legal status could potentially be challenged again. Despite Judge Morrison's definitive ruling 2 years earlier, Martha Henderson, now recognized as Cedar Creek's unofficial community coordinator, stepped forward with characteristic directness. "What's the timeline for legal review?" 6 months to complete municipal charter updates," the messenger answered. 12 months to finalize all legal transitions. Any proceedings deemed inconsistent with state law could be subject to revision or reversal. The crowd dispersed slowly as people absorbed the implications for their individual families and collective community. Change was coming whether they welcomed it or not, and preparation would determine whether that change strengthened or weakened what they had built together. "We need to convene the town council immediately," Martha announced. "Tonight, after evening chores are finished. Everyone who wants Cedar Creek to remain Cedar Creek needs to participate in planning our response." That evening's meeting filled the church beyond capacity as nearly every adult in the community gathered to discuss strategies for protecting their values and legal structures during the transition to statehood. Thomas sat in the front pew with Matthew and Grace playing quietly beside him, living symbols of what was at stake in the discussions ahead. "The question before us," Martha began formally, "is how to ensure that Cedar Creek's character survives the transition to state jurisdiction, while embracing the opportunities that statehood will provide." Samuel Brooks, now recognized as the community's senior statesman despite his advanced age, offered historical perspective. "I've seen territories become states before. Communities that don't plan for change get overwhelmed by it. We need to be proactive rather than reactive." Dr. Hayes raised practical concerns about professional licensing and medical practice regulations that would change under state law. Rebecca Walsh worried about educational standards and teaching requirements. Henry Carlson focused on building codes and business regulations that could affect the community's economic development. But it was Margaret Foster who identified the core issue that connected all other concerns. "What we're really discussing is whether Cedar Creek will remain a place where love and commitment matter more than law and convention, or whether we'll become just another town where rules matter more than relationships." The observation crystallized everyone's understanding of what was truly at stake. Cedar Creek had become something unique in frontier society, a community where chosen families carried equal weight with blood families, where children were raised collectively rather than individually, and where moral authority derived from service rather than status. "I propose we draft a community charter that embeds our values in legal language," suggested William Patterson. "Make our principles part of official municipal law so they can't be easily changed by future residents or external authorities." The suggestion sparked extensive discussion about specific provisions that should be included, legal language that would withstand state scrutiny, and implementation strategies that would ensure community input in all future decisions affecting family structures and child welfare. As the meeting progressed into the late evening hours, Thomas realized that Cedar Creek was facing its most significant challenge since the fight to protect Matthew and Grace 2 years earlier. But this time, the threat came not from external antagonists, but from the success that had attracted attention they hadn't anticipated. The community that had come together to protect 2 abandoned children now needed to protect itself against the forces of change that success inevitably attracted. The stakes were higher than any individual family they were fighting for the survival of a social experiment that had proven love could triumph over law when good people chose to stand together. As families finally departed to put children to bed and prepare for tomorrow's responsibilities, Thomas gathered Matthew and Grace in his arms and walked slowly back to their cabin. Whatever challenges statehood might bring, he was no longer the isolated widower who had struggled alone with impossible decisions. He was part of something larger and stronger than any individual crisis, something worth fighting to preserve for the children who would inherit whatever Cedar Creek became in the years ahead. The drafting of Cedar Creek's community charter had consumed 3 months of intense debate, careful legal research, and delicate negotiations between longtime residents and newer arrivals who brought different visions of what the town should become. As summer deepened into the promise of early autumn, the document that would define their community's future lay spread across the tables of the schoolhouse, awaiting final approval from the territorial capital. Thomas Mitchell stood before the assembled crowd, Matthew perched on his shoulders while Grace held tightly to his hand, as Martha Henderson read the charter's final provisions aloud. The language was formal and legal, but the principles embedded within reflected everything Cedar Creek had fought to protect and preserve. Section 12, Martha continued, her voice carrying the weight of historical significance, establishes that family structures based on love, commitment, and community support shall receive equal recognition and protection under municipal law, regardless of biological relationships or conventional social arrangements. The provision had been the most contentious during drafting, with newer residents arguing that it was too broad and potentially controversial for state authorities to accept. But longtime community members had insisted that legal protection for chosen families was non-negotiable, representing the core value that had made Cedar Creek special. Section 15, Martha Reed on, mandates community input and approval for any changes to child welfare policies, adoption procedures, or family support services. No external authority may override local decisions regarding the welfare of children already established as community members. Dr. Hayes nodded approvingly from his position near the front of the schoolhouse. The section had been his contribution, designed to prevent state authorities from second-guessing decisions, like the adoption of Matthew and Grace, that had been made under territorial law with full community support, but the reading was interrupted by urgent commotion outside the schoolhouse, where several horses had arrived carrying riders who appeared to be official territorial messengers. Through the windows, Thomas could see Henry Carlson speaking intensely with the lead rider, his expression growing increasingly concerned as the conversation progressed. "Ladies and gentlemen," Carlson announced as he entered the schoolhouse, "we have visitors from the territorial capital with news that affects our charter proceedings." The messenger who followed Carlson inside wore the uniform of territorial administration and carried the leather portfolio that typically contained official government business. His expression was grave as he surveyed the assembled community and the charter documents spread across the schoolhouse tables. "I'm Deputy Territorial Administrator James Morrison," the messenger announced. "I'm here regarding irregularities in Cedar Creek's municipal incorporation and concerns about legal procedures that may not comply with pending state requirements." Thomas felt his stomach drop as he recognized the implications. Someone had apparently raised questions about Cedar Creek's legal status and possibly about specific decisions made during their rapid growth and development. What kind of irregularities? Martha Henderson asked with the directness that had made her an effective community leader. Morrison consulted his official documents before responding. Questions have been raised about adoption proceedings conducted under territorial authority that may not meet state standards for legal review and documentation. Specifically, the case of Mitchell versus Walsh regarding custody of minor children. The room fell silent as everyone realized that Thomas's adoption of Matthew and Grace was being challenged again, this time by state authorities who apparently had different standards than the territorial court that had originally approved the arrangements. Judge Morrison's decision was final and legally binding. Dr. Hayes protested immediately. All proper procedures were followed according to territorial law at the time. "Territorial law that may not be recognized under state jurisdiction," Deputy Morrison replied. "State requirements include more extensive background investigations, waiting periods, and documentation standards that weren't applied in this case." Thomas felt the familiar surge of protective fury that came whenever anyone threatened his children, but forced himself to remain calm. Legal battles required strategy and patience rather than emotional reactions, no matter how justified those reactions might be. "Who raised these concerns?" Thomas asked directly. Morrison hesitated before answering, clearly uncomfortable with the implications of his response. A formal complaint was filed by concerned citizens who questioned whether proper legal procedures were followed during the adoption proceedings. "Which citizens?" Martha Henderson demanded, her tone making it clear she suspected the identity of the complainants. Before Morrison could respond, the schoolhouse door opened again to admit 3 of the wealthy Denver families who had arrived in Cedar Creek during the spring. Their leader, Robert Ashford, a man whose expensive clothing and imperious manner had immediately marked him as someone accustomed to getting his way, stepped forward with obvious satisfaction. "Citizens who believe that legal adoption should follow established procedures rather than community sentiment," Ashford announced. Children deserve protection from irregular arrangements that might not serve their best interests. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. Ashford and his allies had never shown any interest in Matthew and Grace's welfare, but were apparently willing to use the children as weapons in their campaign to reshape Cedar Creek according to their preferences. "Mr. Ashford," Thomas said with carefully controlled anger, "these children have been loved, protected, and nurtured by this entire community for over 2 years. Their best interests have never been in question. According to whose judgment?" Ashford retorted. "A frontier preacher with no legal training and a community with no oversight? State law requires professional evaluation and ongoing monitoring to ensure children's proper development." The argument revealed the fundamental conflict between two different approaches to child welfare, Cedar Creek's collective responsibility model, versus the institutional oversight model preferred by more conventional communities. But the confrontation was interrupted by yet another arrival that would change everything about the day's proceedings. A single rider approached the schoolhouse at a gallop, dismounting before her horse had fully stopped and rushing toward the building with obvious urgency. The woman who burst through the schoolhouse door was instantly recognizable to Thomas despite the 2 years that had passed since their last meeting. Emma Walsh, one of the twin mothers who had given birth in his church and entrusted their children to his care, stood before the assembled community with the dusty clothing and determined expression of someone who had traveled far and fast. "I heard about the legal challenge," Emma announced breathlessly, her gaze immediately finding Matthew and Grace and softening with unmistakable maternal love. "I came to testify about my decision and my children's welfare." The appearance of one of the biological mothers transformed the entire legal situation. Emma Walsh could provide first-hand testimony about her decision to place the children with Thomas, the circumstances that had led to that choice, and her continued support for the arrangement. "Miss Walsh," Deputy Morrison said formally, "your testimony would indeed be relevant to these proceedings. Are you prepared to provide sworn statements about the adoption arrangements?" "I'm prepared to provide whatever testimony is necessary to protect my children and the man who saved their lives," Emma replied with fierce determination. Thomas felt overwhelming gratitude mixed with concern about what Emma's sudden appearance might mean for her own safety and future. If Patrick Walsh was still seeking to control his daughters, Emma's public testimony could expose her to renewed persecution. "Emma," Thomas said quietly, "are you sure about this? There might be consequences. For you personally." "There are consequences for hiding too," Emma replied. "I've spent 2 years working in mining camps, sending money when I could, and wondering whether my children were growing up safe and loved. When I heard that someone was questioning your right to raise them, I knew I had to come." Martha Henderson stepped forward with practical concerns. "Where's Lucy? Is she safe?" "Lucy's in California," Emma explained. "She married a good man last year, a widower with children of his own, who accepted her completely. She wanted to come too, but couldn't travel in her condition." Emma's smile was radiant as she delivered the news. "She's expecting another baby in the spring." The information about Lucy's happiness and new family provided powerful testimony about the positive outcomes that could result from the twins' original decision to place their children for adoption rather than attempting to raise them under impossible circumstances. "This is all very touching," Robert Ashford interrupted coldly, "but personal anecdotes don't override legal requirements. State law demands proper procedures regardless of emotional attachments." Emma Walsh turned to face Ashford with the kind of controlled fury that only mothers protecting their children could muster. "Mr. Ashford, is it? I gave birth to these children in a snowstorm with only Reverend Mitchell's help because my father threw me out to die rather than accept responsibility for helping his pregnant daughter. The man you're trying to remove from their lives literally saved all 3 of us." "That doesn't change legal requirements," Ashford replied stubbornly. "Then maybe the legal requirements are wrong." Emma shot back. My children are healthy, happy, and loved. They live in a community where everyone cares about their welfare. What more could any law require? Deputy Morrison had been taking notes throughout the confrontation, clearly recognizing that he was witnessing something far more complex than a simple legal dispute. The presence of the biological mother supporting the adoption, combined with obvious community investment in the children's welfare, created circumstances that would be difficult for any court to overturn. Miss Walsh, Morrison said formally, are you prepared to provide sworn testimony that you freely chose to place these children with Reverend Mitchell and that you continue to support that decision? Absolutely, Emma replied without hesitation. It was the best decision I ever made, and seeing them now confirms that completely. As Emma knelt to greet Matthew and Grace, who had been watching the adult drama with the curious attention of children who sensed important events but couldn't understand their implications, Thomas realized that this confrontation represented more than just another legal challenge. It was a test of whether love and community commitment could withstand institutional pressure, and whether frontier values could survive the transition to more conventional social structures. The outcome would determine not only his family's future, but the character of Cedar Creek itself as it navigated the treacherous waters between frontier independence and statehood conformity. But for this moment, watching Emma's joyful reunion with the children she had sacrificed everything to protect, Thomas felt renewed confidence that truth and love would ultimately prevail over bureaucracy and convention. The battle was far from over, but they were no longer fighting it alone. 5 years later, the autumn of 1892 brought the kind of crisp October morning that made Montana Territory, now Montana State, feel like the most beautiful place on earth. Thomas Mitchell stood on the steps of Cedar Creek's new stone church, watching his 7-year-old children race across the town square with a dozen other youngsters whose laughter echoed off the buildings that now housed over 1,000 residents. Matthew had grown into a sturdy boy whose fearless curiosity had evolved into natural leadership among his peers. At 7, he could already read better than many adults and showed remarkable skill with numbers that Dr. Hayes predicted would serve him well in whatever profession he chose. More importantly, he possessed the kind of instinctive kindness that made other children gravitate toward him naturally. Grace, equally tall but more contemplative, had become the unofficial teacher's assistant at Cedar Creek's expanded school. Her love of learning and patient way with younger children suggested a future in education, though Thomas was careful never to limit her possibilities. In a community that had fought so hard for the principle that love mattered more than convention, his daughter would have every opportunity to pursue whatever dreams she developed. "Papa, can we show the new families the creek?" Matthew called from across the square, where he and Grace had been appointed as unofficial ambassadors for the latest group of settlers who had traveled from as far as Ohio and Pennsylvania to join Cedar Creek's celebrated community. "Of course," Thomas replied, waving permission while marveling at how naturally his children had assumed responsibility for welcoming newcomers. The trait reflected everything Cedar Creek had become, a place where established residents automatically included new arrivals in the extended family network that defined their social structure. The town itself had transformed beyond recognition. From the struggling frontier settlement of 7 years earlier, the main street now boasted 2 general stores, a proper hotel, a bank, a newspaper office, and enough professional services to support a regional economy. The original wooden buildings had been replaced or expanded with stone and brick construction. That spoke of permanence and prosperity, but the most remarkable change was impossible to measure in buildings or businesses. Cedar Creek had become something unprecedented in frontier society, a community where chosen families carried equal weight with blood families, where children were raised collectively rather than individually, and where moral authority derived from service rather than status or wealth. Reverend Mitchell, called Mayor Rebecca Patterson, formerly Rebecca Walsh, as she approached with a leather portfolio containing the week's official correspondence. "We received wonderful news from the state capitol." Rebecca had been elected mayor the previous year, making Cedar Creek one of the first Montana communities to choose female leadership. Her practical wisdom and diplomatic skills had proven invaluable in managing the community's rapid growth while preserving the values that had made that growth possible. "The governor is requesting permission to use Cedar Creek as a model for other territorial developments," Rebecca continued, opening the portfolio to reveal official state documents. "They want to study our municipal charter and community structures as examples of successful frontier governance." The recognition was deeply satisfying to Thomas, who remembered the desperate uncertainty of those early years when their very survival had seemed doubtful. Cedar Creek's success had vindicated every principle they had fought to establish and every sacrifice they had made to protect their chosen family structures. "There's more," Rebecca added with a smile. "The University of Montana wants to establish a regional campus here, specifically because of our educational innovations and community support systems. They're offering full funding for facilities and faculty." The university proposal represented the kind of opportunity that Thomas had hardly dared imagine when he first accepted responsibility for 2 abandoned infants. Higher education in Cedar Creek would ensure that Matthew, Grace, and their generation could pursue advanced learning without leaving the community that had nurtured them. "What about the Ashford situation?" Thomas asked, referring to the ongoing legal challenges that Robert Ashford and his allies had maintained despite their repeated defeats in territorial and state courts. "Finally resolved," Rebecca replied with obvious satisfaction. "The state Supreme Court upheld our municipal charter in its entirety and specifically ruled that our adoption procedures exceeded state requirements for legal validity. Ashford's group has exhausted all appeals. The legal victory was more than personal vindication. It established precedent that would protect other communities that chose to embrace innovative family structures and child welfare policies." Cedar Creek's experiment in collective parenting had become accepted law throughout Montana. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a familiar figure who had become a regular visitor to Cedar Creek over the past several years. Emma Walsh, now Emma Chun, having married a Chinese-American merchant in Butte, approached with her own 3-year-old daughter in tow, making one of her quarterly visits to see Matthew and Grace. "Emma," Grace called joyfully, abandoning her playmates to rush toward the woman who had given her life and then sacrificed her own happiness to ensure that life would flourish. The relationship between Emma and her biological children had evolved into something unique and beautiful, not mother and child in the conventional sense, but something deeper and more complex that honored both biological connection and chosen family loyalty. "Look how tall you've grown," Emma said, embracing Grace while Matthew approached more cautiously, still processing the complex emotions that Emma's visits always triggered. At 7, he was beginning to understand the full story of his origins and the sacrifices that multiple adults had made to give him the life he enjoyed. "Mama Emma," Grace said, using the title they had developed to distinguish Emma from the community mothers who had raised them. "Will you come to our school presentation? Tomorrow, we're showing new families how Cedar Creek works." "I wouldn't miss it," Emma replied warmly, though Thomas noticed the bittersweet expression that always crossed her face when she witnessed the children's obvious happiness and security. The sacrifice had been worth it, but that didn't make it painless. Emma's daughter Lily had inherited her mother's quick intelligence and her father's gentle disposition. At 3, she was already showing signs of the bilingual fluency that would serve her well in the increasingly diverse territory, and she adored her half-siblings despite their complicated relationship. "How's Lucy doing?" Thomas asked, inquiring about Emma's twin sister, whose letters provided regular updates, but whose distance in California prevented frequent visits. Expecting her fourth child this winter, Emma replied with obvious pride. James treats her like a queen, and his older children have fully accepted her as their mother. She's become the heart of their family, just like she always was the heart of ours. The news about Lucy's continued happiness provided ongoing validation of the twins' original decision to prioritize their children's welfare over their own immediate desires. Both women had found love and family in new situations, while their first children had thrived in the environment they had chosen for them. "There's something else I need to tell you," Emma said, her expression growing serious. "I received a letter from Chicago last month. Patrick Walsh died this spring pneumonia, apparently. His estate lawyers are trying to locate his heirs for inheritance purposes." The news about their grandfather's death created complicated emotions. For Matthew and Grace, who had never met the man but understood his role in their family story, Thomas felt a mixture of sadness for a life that had ended in bitterness and relief that the threat of renewed custody challenges had been permanently eliminated. "Do the lawyers know about the children?" Thomas asked. "They know Patrick had daughters who disappeared," Emma replied. "But they don't know about grandchildren, and Lucy and I have no intention of providing information that might complicate Matthew and Grace's legal status." The decision reflected the mature wisdom that both sisters had developed through their difficult experiences. Money and property meant less than security and stability for the children they had entrusted to others' care. As afternoon shadows lengthened across the town square, the community began gathering for their weekly celebration that had evolved from the original Sunday services into something more comprehensive, part worship, part town meeting, part social gathering that reinforced the bonds holding their extended family together. Thomas stood before the assembled crowd of over 1,000 people, representing families from dozens of states and territories who had traveled to Cedar Creek specifically because of its reputation for inclusive community values and successful child-rearing practices. "Friends," Thomas began, using the informal address that had replaced conventional titles in Cedar Creek's egalitarian social structure. "7 years ago, 2 desperate young women brought their children to our church steps, seeking help they couldn't find anywhere else." The familiar story never lost its power to move the community. But Thomas's purpose tonight was different from simple reminiscence. He wanted to acknowledge how completely their experiment in collective family building had succeeded beyond anyone's original hopes or expectations. "Those 2 babies became the heart around which our entire community grew," Thomas continued, gesturing toward Matthew and Grace, who sat in the front row with dozens of other children who thought of them as siblings rather than mere friends. "They taught us that love creates family more surely than blood, and that community commitment can overcome any challenge when good people choose to stand together." The applause that followed was warm and sustained, acknowledging not just Thomas's role as father and community leader, but the collective achievement that Cedar Creek represented. They had proven that frontier communities could innovate socially as well as economically, creating new models for human relationships that serve children's needs better than conventional institutions. But tonight, Thomas continued as the applause subsided, "I want to recognize something even more remarkable than our past success. Look around this room. Count the families who came here specifically because they heard about our approach to child welfare and community support. Count the children who are growing up in an environment where every adult takes responsibility for every child's welfare." The count was indeed remarkable. Of the 1,000+ residents now calling Cedar Creek home, more than half had arrived within the past 3 years, drawn by stories of successful collective parenting and community values that prioritized human welfare over conventional social restrictions. Emma and Lucy Walsh didn't just save their own children when they brought them here, Thomas concluded. They saved all our children by showing us that love and sacrifice can create something better than tradition and convention. As the community meeting evolved into the informal socializing that always followed formal business, Thomas found himself surrounded by the extended family network that had grown from 2 abandoned infants into a multi-generational community of choice. Matthew and Grace played with their dozens of chosen siblings, while their biological mother, Emma, chatted with the woman who had become their practical mother, Martha Henderson. Dr. Hayes examined scraped knees with the same attention he gave to serious medical conditions. Henry Carlson taught carpentry skills to any child old enough to hold tools safely. At 7 years old, Matthew and Grace Mitchell had become the living symbols of everything Cedar Creek had achieved. They were healthy, happy, intelligent children who had never known anything but love and security. More importantly, they were growing up in a community that had organized itself around the principle that children's welfare mattered more than adult convenience or social convention. The abandoned babies had become the foundation for 1,000 grateful settlers who had found in Cedar Creek the kind of supportive community environment that seemed increasingly rare in an industrializing nation. Their legacy would endure in the laws, customs, and values that would shape Montana's development for generations to come. As Thomas Mitchell gathered his family for the walk home through streets lit by the warm glow of 1,000 welcoming windows, he reflected on the miraculous journey that had begun with 2 desperate young women seeking help for their newborn children. The widowed preacher, who had once questioned his faith and purpose, had found both renewed through the simple act of accepting responsibility for 2 vulnerable lives. The children who had been abandoned by blood family had gained something far more valuable, a community family that would protect and nurture them, regardless of whatever challenges the future might bring. Cedar Creek had become proof that sometimes the greatest blessings emerge from the most desperate circumstances, and that love really can triumph over law when good people choose to stand together in defense of what matters most. The story that had begun with abandonment had become a legacy of hope that would inspire frontier communities for decades to come. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.